Most people assume they would recognize danger immediately. That if a serial killer walked right up to them, they would somehow know. But real life doesn't usually work that way. Because some of the most dangerous people in history looked completely normal. They smiled, they joked, they offered help, they blended in. And today's stories are not about the victims that didn't survive. They're about the people that got away. Women who trusted their instincts, people who noticed that something felt wrong. These are survivors that escaped situations that could have ended very differently. And in some cases, they didn't realize until much later what exactly they escaped. Today, we are diving into real stories of people who narrowly escaped serial killers. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Spooky Files. If you're returning, thank you so much for coming back. And if you're new here, we're so glad to have you. I'm your host, Mary Ellen Quigley. This is where we dive into the paranormal, the unexplained, the I swear I saw something, but I don't want to admit it moments that we all have and now have a place to talk about them. Today's episode is definitely a little darker than usual because the truth is that some of the scariest things in the world are not paranormal at all. Sometimes the scariest thing is another human being. And what makes these stories that we're going to talk about so disturbing is how ordinary they seem at first. A parking lot conversation, a ride home, a date, a stranger at a gas station. One small decision standing between survival or ending up as another headline. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and let's get into it. Story 1, Ted Bundy. We're starting off with one of the most famous survival stories connected to serial killer Ted Bundy. And what makes this story extra creepy is how normal it all began. On November 8th, 1974, 18-year-old Carol Durant was shopping at Fashion Place Mall in Murray, Utah. While walking through the parking lot, she was approached by a clean-cut man who identified himself as a police officer. The man told her that someone had attempted to break into her car. According to Carol's later courtroom testimony and interviews discussed by the Salt Lake Tribune and multiple Bundy documentaries, this man seemed calm, polite, and trustworthy. Nothing about him felt dangerous. He offered to drive her to the police station so she could file a report. And at first, she agreed. This man was named Ted Bundy. But as soon as she got into the car, Carol began to feel uneasy. Then she noticed something horrifying. The police station that he was driving her to, Bundy ended up passing that up. And moments later, he attempted to handcuff her. Carol fought back violently. She kicked, scratched, and screamed, and somehow she escaped the vehicle alive. Years later, Carol repeatedly said that she survived because she stopped ignoring the feeling that something wasn't right. And that is a recurring theme that you hear from a lot of people that came across Ted Bundy over the years. They all say that he didn't look dangerous. He seemed like a safe person. And that was the entire reason he was so successful for so long. But while Ted Bundy relied heavily on charm and trust, other killers used fear. And in some cases, survival depended entirely on staying calm long enough to escape. Story 2 is Lisa McVeigh. In November of 1984, 17-year-old Lisa McVeigh was riding her bike home from work in Tampa, Florida, when she was abducted by serial killer Bobby Joe Long. What happened afterwards is one of the most remarkable survival stories in true crime history. According to Lisa's later interviews and reporting from outlets including Crime and Investigation and People magazine, Lisa realized very quickly that her panic would get her killed. So instead, she focused on staying calm. She talked to Long constantly. She humanized herself. She intentionally tried to make him see her as a person instead of an object. And at the same time, she memorized everything she could. Roads, turns, sounds, smells, objects in the room around her. Any detail she could hold on to that might help the police catch this person if she ever got free. And at one point, Lisa said that she deliberately left fingerprints throughout the apartment because she wanted evidence linking her there if she didn't survive. And somehow, after hours of captivity, Long released her. Police initially doubted her story, but Lisa's memory was so detailed that investigators were eventually able to identify and arrest Bobby Joe Long. This story is terrifying because Lisa survived entirely through intelligence and instinct, not luck, not chance. Pure survival thinking under unimaginable pressure. But sometimes people survive because they listen to a feeling before something happens at all. And our next story might be one of the best examples of that. Story number 3 is called The Dating Game Killer. In 1978, a woman named Cheryl Bradshaw appeared on the TV show The Dating Game. One of the contestants was a photographer named Rodney Alcala. At the time, nobody knew that Alcala was a serial killer. To viewers, he seemed confident, funny, and a little strange. And Cheryl actually chose him as the winning contestant, which meant they were supposed to go on a date afterward. But according to later interviews and reporting from outlets like ABC News, Cheryl changed her mind almost immediately after meeting him off camera. Some reports described her calling him creepy. Others simply said that she felt deeply uncomfortable around him. Either way, she trusted her instincts and decided not to go on the date. Years later, Alcala would be convicted of multiple murders. And honestly, this story sticks with people because it's such a small moment. One uncomfortable feeling leading to one canceled date. And her future may have been entirely different if she hadn't listened to herself. Those tiny moments matter more than people realize. Most close calls probably never become famous stories. Some people just go home, lock the doors, and never realize how close they came to danger. Story 4 is The Bar Invitation. This story comes from a Reddit thread where users discussed encounters they later believed may have involved violent criminals or potential serial killers. Now, obviously, stories online should be approached carefully because sometimes they're not always trustworthy, but this particular story stuck with me because of how believable it feels. A user described reconnecting with an old acquaintance at a bar several years after high school, and at first, the interaction seemed normal. The man was friendly, talkative, a little persistent, but according to the post, he repeatedly pressured the woman to leave with him to go to a party happening outside town. And the woman wrote that something about this behavior felt wrong. Not threatening, but just off. Eventually, one of her friends intervened and convinced her not to go. About a week later, the man was arrested in connection with multiple murders. Now, there's no way to independently verify anonymous online stories like this, but that's the part that makes them extra scary. Because not every dangerous encounter becomes a Netflix documentary. Sometimes the only thing separating you from tragedy is a friend reminding you not to go. But while some survivors escaped before anything happened, others escaped after realizing they were trapped inside a nightmare. And our next story seems almost impossible to believe because of how cinematic it sounds, but it is a true story. Story 5 is Cindy Paulson. By the early 1980s, Alaska was unknowingly home to one of the most horrifying serial killers in American history. Robert Hansen abducted women and flew them into the Alaskan wilderness before hunting them. That sentence alone sounds like something from a horror movie. But one woman escaped. and her name was Cindy Paulson. In June of 1983, according to a report later covered by outlets including the Anchorage Daily News and several true crime books about the case, Cindy was abducted by Hansen and taken to his home. At one point, Hansen left briefly to prepare his plane for a flight, and somehow Cindy escaped, still handcuffed. She ran barefoot to the road and flagged down a passing truck driver. And what's incredible is that the police initially struggled to believe her story because the idea of a respected local businessman abducting women and hunting them in the wilderness sounded a little far-fetched. But eventually, Cindy's testimony helped investigators connect Hansen to multiple murders. This story is one of the most horrifying examples of survival instinct I've ever heard because she escaped from someone who had planned out every step of what was supposed to happen next, and the idea of being dropped off in the wilderness and hunted, absolutely terrifying. But while Robert Hansen hunted victims in isolation, our next killer blended into ordinary life so completely that people often didn't realize they were in danger until almost too late. And story 6 is Richard Ramirez. By the summer of 1985, California was terrified of Richard Ramirez. The media called him the Night Stalker. And according to interviews featured in the Los Angeles Times, many people who encountered Ramirez described feeling uneasy around him at the start. One woman later recalled seeing a strange man lingering near her apartment complex late at night. Nothing threatening happened. He didn't attack her or even speak to her. But she later said that when she saw him, she felt unsafe. Days later, she saw Richard Ramirez's face on television after police released his photo, and she recognized him. There are multiple stories like this connected to Ramirez. Neighbors, store clerks, people at gas stations are seeing him out in public. Ordinary interactions that are horrifying in hindsight. It makes you wonder, how many strangers do we pass every single day without thinking twice? And we have no idea of the dark past that they actually have. But our final story might be the most disturbing of all because this killer looked so ordinary that people repeatedly ignored the warning signs until it was almost too late. And story number 7 is Jeffrey Dahmer. One of the most horrifying things about Jeffrey Dahmer is how normal people described him. He was quiet, awkward, and forgettable. Not scary at all. That normal appearance is what helped him lure victims back to his apartment for years. But there were also people who escaped. One man later described entering Dahmer's apartment and feeling like something was wrong. According to interviews later featured in documentaries, he described the apartment as having a heavy feeling and an awful smell, which we all now know what the awful smell was about. Dahmer repeatedly became agitated when the man attempted to leave, but eventually he got out safely. And then there's one of the most tragic near-escape stories connected to Dahmer. In 1991, a 14-year-old boy named Konorak Sintasumphone escaped Dahmer's apartment and made it outside. Witnesses tried to intervene. They even called the police. But after speaking with Dahmer, he convinced them it was his boyfriend who had drank a little too much alcohol, and the boy was returned to the apartment. Now, this was portrayed in the Netflix series about Jeffrey Dahmer and is probably one of the most heartbreaking scenes because this boy was so close to getting free. And this story is probably one of the most difficult ones to hear because this person's survival came down to whether people chose to listen when someone says they're afraid. And I think that's why so many people are fascinated by serial killers. Most of the time, they don't look like your typical movie monster. They look completely ordinary. And in almost every story that I shared with you, the survivors all say the same thing. There was no proof, no evidence, nothing about this person that would have made them stand out as someone who was harming others. The only thing they had was their instinct, a feeling, a hesitation, something inside them saying that something isn't right. And maybe that's the real lesson in stories like these. Sometimes trusting your instinct looks dramatic in movies, but sometimes it looks like saying no, leaving early, canceling a date, or not getting into a car. And thankfully, because these people listen to their instinct, they're still here with us today. And that brings us to the end of this episode of the Spooky Files. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend, follow me on social media, leave a comment because I love hearing from all of you. If you have a story you would like to share on the podcast, you can send it to the spookyfilespodcast@gmail.com or fill out the contact us form on thespookyfilespodcast.com. I read every single email or message, and it helps us build a community of people that don't just love the paranormal and the unexplained, but want a place to talk about all of the things we don't always admit out loud. Make sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. If you're looking for more paranormal content, check out Hoosier Myths and Legends, a podcast I do with my sister where we share all things spooky from the state of Indiana. Season 7 starts on May 30th. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep it spooky, my friends.